Usiangalie kama hii tu. So utaanza show hapa nakwambia.
Sijui unachezea wapi. Tenda sana tunaanza mdogo
Fanya hivi
Nitasema hivi.
itakuwa tu hivi.
Alafu nianze sorry. Tuko sawa? Unanisikia? Unani Good morning, and thank you for joining us wherever you're joining us from. This is Power 254, and I'll be introducing the panel in just a bit. The 28th Africa France Summit is coming up this July 2021 in Montpellier. This summit is usually held every 3 years, alternately in France and in an African country. So this time round, rather than the heads of state, this year's summit brings together the players of civil society at the center of the game. We're talking about entrepreneurs, about intellectuals, researchers, artists, athletes, journalists, basically allowing us all a fresh look at Africa's relationship with France and with ourselves. It provides an opportunity for us to make deep reflections and discuss what needs to change and what that means for us as Africans. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, said, "Our goal is to put forward the people who embody generational renewal." And I believe that is us, the youth, and even we as Africans at the center of these conversations. This conversation is brought to you courtesy of the Embassy of France in Kenya in collaboration with Power 254. We shall take a moment and discuss the topic, freedom of expression in a digital world. I'll introduce my panel this morning, and I'm sure they're very familiar with all of you. So we have John Alanamu, not a stranger to us. I feel like I grew up knowing John Alanamu, watching him, never mind we're age mates, right? He's an investigative journalist and the CEO of Africa Uncensored. Africa Uncensored is an investigative and in-depth journalism production house based in Nairobi. Its ambition is to be the premier source of unique, important, and incisive journalism. Welcome, John Alan.
Thank you.
Then next to him we have Godfrey. Hey, I never even knew your names. I just knew you as Gado. So we have Godfrey Mwapembwa. He's also a household name. I grew up with seeing in the newspaper, if you were reading the newspaper as much as I was, or at least had access to one. He's known as Gado. He's a political cartoonist, animator, and comics artist. All those cartoons you saw in the papers decades ago, this is that guy. And you saw some of them also by the late Wahome Mutahi. Gado is the most syndicated political cartoonist in East and Central Africa. And for over 2 decades, he's been a contributor for the Daily Nation, the New African, Courier International, Business Day, and Sunday Tribune, just to mention but a few. Then next to him is Abdifatah Hassan Ali. Abdifatah is a human rights defender, a blogger, and founder of Digital Shelter, a local initiative promoting digital safety, digital rights and inclusion, and internet freedom in Somalia specifically. Throughout his career, Abdi has focused his activism on advocating on the voiceless community in his country. He has worked extensively on the rights of internally displaced persons, minority groups, and others who have been marginalized and affected by conflict. Abdi also is an active social media campaigner and blogger addressing key human rights issues in Somalia. He's currently focusing on defending human rights in the digital age. He will tell us more about that. So by far, Kenya is considered one of the most democratic countries in this region, right? And when you think about it, we're probably an envy to many in the region. Compared to our neighbors, we feel like we can say anything about anyone. And now more than ever, Kenyans have become so much bolder and are speaking truth to power, of course, digitally. Yeah? We're living in a digitalized life. Our lives are basically on social media. But are we really free? Do we have freedom of expression? Are people's voice amplified or are they being muffled? Are we truly free to say what we feel like saying? Abdi, most of us here probably will need to take shelter at your place if we say everything we want to say, right? So maybe you can start by telling us what digital shelter is, when and why you started it.
Good morning, and thank you very much again for inviting me in this panel discussion. I am privileged actually to be joining these two gentlemen, prominent Kenyan panelists that I am joining this morning. Digital Shelter was born out of digital age. It's a product of internet and digital generation. It was created 4 years ago in Somalia by a group of bloggers and human rights defenders, especially bloggers who are working and depending their life and work on the internet. We saw that internet was an essential and fundamental part of our life, and we thought that we need to come up with an initiative that promotes digital rights, digital inclusion, and internet freedom in Somalia. We mostly work on promoting around these thematic areas that I've just mentioned through collaboration with grassroots communities, with government authorities, with other civil society, with regional partners and networks, because we live in a country where freedom of expression in the offline context has declined, and internet is giving us a voice and basically amplifying our voice, and we need to take advantage on this opportunity. So that's how the whole idea of Digital Shelter was born 4 years ago, and we are currently working across Somalia, actually, except the northern part of the country. And also we are regularly engaging with other network and members within the African region, and also beyond the Africa region at the international level.
So I'm curious, when you say shelter, I think of a house, I think of home, I think of safety. Is this something that you provide for the people that come to Digital Shelter, and if so, how?
Under our digital rights, basically we have another component called digital safety. What we do basically is that we work with journalists and human rights defenders and bloggers who are facing threats or risks in the digital space in their line of work. So we do capacity building programs on digital security, digital protection, and especially people who are facing harassment and online, cyberbullying on social media because of their work, or because of simply expressing their opinion in this digital space. So the digital shelter, it's right. When you hear the word shelter, it's safety. We also do that capacity building component in addition to the advocacy and campaigns we do.
Okay, interesting. So would you say that there is there is freedom of expression as much as it would be, or how do you envision what our freedom as we think it is looks like?
I think, let me start by saying freedom of expression in the online space was born out of two things. First, decline in the traditional offline context, because we have seen that in my country, for instance, it's very difficult to express your opinion or your views in the offline world, and in many other African contexts. And also the second thing is availability of open and affordable internet, in at least in some countries in the continent. These two led us to this digital world where we are able to freely and openly express our opinion. So you have our governments, for instance, in the continent, have managed to successfully suppress and come up with restrictive measures to control and contain freedom of expression in the online context. People are now resorting in the digital platforms. So, for instance, if I want to raise something against my government, I cannot organize demonstration in the street. It's very difficult and it will be very risky. I am now able to raise that concern in the digital world, especially on social media platforms. So, before we talk about freedom of expression in the digital world, we need to discuss, and this is basically what we do with our community and with our partners. We discuss access to affordable and open internet. That's where the thing starts. Because if I don't have access to internet, then there's no freedom of expression. Then we came to the digital world, and we are now enjoying freedom of expression in this digital space. But again, the same our governments are again coming up with another restrictive and draconian measures to control the digital space again, which is very tricky and complicated. So I will talk about later in the techniques and what the freedom expression in digital world is facing. But we need to understand and actually start our discussion. This basic point of having access to internet, not only access to internet, but also access to open and affordable internet across all the countries and all the continent.
It's interesting when you talk about open and accessible, affordable access to information. And we were speaking about this the other day recently with someone about the way, when we think about who has access to internet, who are we talking to and what messages are going out? And can people then react and respond accordingly, right? Are people able to raise the issues that they want to raise because they don't, because they can, right? And that brings me to you, Alan, about the quality of a journalist is really his or her independence to tell the story that they want to tell. With the rise of access to internet and people being online, there's this citizen journalism, which means that I feel like it's overtaken the way stories were told before, because then things came out of the newsroom, team was sent, you go do some fact finding, then you come and tell and then verification, and then the story is told. But with the burst of the internet, there's news coming from everywhere. Some could be fake, some could be real, but who's verifying, who's checking, Unless maybe we wait, it hits the mainstream media, then we say, okay, maybe there's something there. But when you think about it, so now, who is the media?
Gosh, that's a big question, Jerry. That's a very big question.
Yeah.
If I'm to speak generally, I'd say the media is just in terms of even the tools that you have, the media is anybody who has a device that can access the internet and has information to share. And what that tells you fundamentally is that there's been a huge shift from how we viewed media before in the past. So we, as traditional or legacy media, were the intermediaries, were the sieve that news would kind of be sifted through, and then the public would watch on appointment at 7 o'clock, at 9 o'clock, or whatever other appointments there were. But now, anybody with a phone, anybody with access to the internet can essentially be a producer of news. What perhaps more fundamentally we should think about is what is the role of people who have trained and studied let me not call it the art, but the profession of the media today, now that there's so much access and there's so many voices. And I don't think that it's a bad thing, by the way. I think that it's a good thing that we have this multiplicity of opinions and voices and sources that can allow us to get a much fuller understanding of what's going on. The question is really about the role, right? But Abdi said something that really struck me, because it's something that I've been thinking about for some time in the more recent past. It's a matter of access. You see, what the internet and what being online affords to people today isn't just, it's not just access to have a conversation. It's access to education. It's access to opportunity. It's access to conversation. And it is becoming more and more a fundamental part of how we live in this generation. And therefore, it must be something that's guaranteed to as many people as possible. If we think about it in the context of energy, let me give an example. If we think about the cost of energy in the 90s, when we were thinking about renewable energy, it was too expensive for anybody to afford. For you to have a solar panel, that meant that you are a rich person, right? What it took was government interventions at various levels to ensure that the people who were innovating around solar energy were given the right kind of incentives and subsidies to start making that process cheaper, right? And eventually it became cheaper. If you look at access across the continent, yes, we're getting more smartphones. Yes, there's more people with smartphones in their pockets across the world. But the question of access is really something that can't be dealt with, just through a smartphone. You need money to be able to access it. Who's dealing or who's thinking about that question of how many people can genuinely access the internet? COVID-19 has shown us that it can be a fundamental part of how we teach our kids. right? And if there are only certain people who can teach their children or have their children access education online, what does that mean for everybody else? Transposing that to media, I'd say that it's really also another. It also boils down to a question of access. In as much as there are many people who are accessing the internet, is it really everybody? Are we really hearing all of the voices? Can we get what's happening at the border between Ethiopia and Turkana on a daily basis, so that we don't have to dispatch teams or depend on official sources to understand what's happening in a specific context? It really boils down to access in some ways. So I know this is a bit long-winded, but that's kind of how I'm looking at it.
It was a big question, though. As an investigative journalist, I know there's a lot of work, and I know there's also from experience that there's a lot of work that goes behind it, so that by the time you're coming to tell your story, there's been all those layers of fact-checking and verification. How do you feel when your work is put on the same level of relevance as bloggers and influencers? Now that, with all these, no offense meant.
Hey, Jerry, you're really bringing the big questions to me. Okay, let me go through how I, kind of the range of emotions that I felt. At first, I felt offended, of course, but that I realized later was really just being defensive. It was thinking very defensively. Then I moved into acceptance. Like, we kind of have to accept that this is the way the world is.
It is what it is.
It is what it is, right? But what, again, is happening is that I feel the challenge. And I want to rise to meet the challenge of being able to elevate my work so that not only are the facts correct, not only is the information, credible, but the storytelling is also good. I think that's one thing that perhaps the media has been kind of lazy about, specifically in news media, which is the storytelling around the subjects that we interrogate. There are people out there who've shown us that stories about business don't have to be boring and don't have to be pigeonholed in the second half of news. They can be lively, they can be interesting. And that's a challenge also to investigative reporters. So I think in one way that's the way it's challenged me. Do I feel offended that today that my work is put on the same level as people who blog independently? No, I don't. I think I feel challenged, and I want to rise to meet that challenge. What does irritate me is the lack of action after that, after the fact. Because what it tells you is that there are people who, especially people in power, who depend on the cacophony, who depend on the noise to make sure that things just kind of move along quickly when there are important things that are being said. That's really something that I struggle with. But then again, it is what it is, but it isn't what it should be. Yeah.
Right. I like that. It is what it is, but it's not the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, that's true. Do you feel like there are natural limitations that you have found in your freedom of expression as a journalist? And what would those be?
Natural limitations.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the question of access is both digital and offline, right? Can I get to the stories that I want to tell quickly enough? Am I restricted by physical, bureaucratic and other kinds of boundaries? Yes. Another question around access is access to information. We say one thing and we aspire to one thing in our constitution and in our laws, but in the real sense, access to information is something that's very closely guarded, and the gatekeepers of that still keep the same colonial attitudes around what the public should know and what it shouldn't. And you see that a lot of that playing out in how we access information around COVID-19 as an example. And then there's the real question of danger to journalists, to people who are blogging and writing independently, that a person, whatever his opinions or her opinions, can be picked up and harassed, and state force being brought to bear on one individual simply because of their opinions or whether offensive or not. Motemi Wakiama was picked up and was charged, and huge amounts of bail were placed because he offended somebody and that's happening with increasing frequency and consistency that should worry all of us. And those are the kinds of things that bother me about the environment. It might not have happened to me, but the saying, if someone else's head is being shaved, just wait and it's going to be your turn soon.
That's true. Have you felt like your freedom has been infringed on because you're an investigative journalist? And maybe could you share with us what instances those might have been? Like maybe you need to not say this, or I just will not go there because of what could happen. Some stories that you have dropped because of what you're afraid could happen if you went that way?
This is going to sound strange because it doesn't seem like some of the restrictions that we had in the past. But one real consideration that I've seen a lot of our journalists having to weigh is, how will this be received in the digital space? Will it become a source for trolling? Will I be targeted online? And what impact will that have on my own safety, my own digital safety, as an example? That's a consideration that a lot of people are making in this day and age about the kinds of stories that we can tell. What that means is that inconvenient truths these days are left to the people out there who are brave enough to be able to do that. And I'd say within legacy media, not that I'm legacy media anymore, those kinds of inconvenient truths are not spoken about frequently enough because of the danger that reputation, in terms of your reputation, you will suffer heavily. It isn't so much a concern for us, but I'd say just the mental torment of having to go through telling a story and then having someone spin something else and not overtaking everything else prevents people from being brave enough to do stories that might be offensive, might go against the grain, but are true. That's a concern. I think the other thing is really what I spoke about. I often wonder, when will that day come that I will do a story that rubs someone the wrong way, and I'll just be walking along, my merry way and get picked up and harassed for no other reason than I did something that was offensive to the powers that be.
Wow, that's quite something. I think something we need to sit with and brood on is that reality that there's somewhere, some place, some story I would rather not tell because of what you're talking about. I could get trolled, and what that means for you, right? And I think even personally in my line of work, I have seen people who have heavily been trolled, and I have seen the impact it has had on people. And like you're saying, when I think about our freedom of expression, are we really free to express ourselves? And not necessarily because of powers that may be, but just because, of trolls. I'd rather not go there because it's not so much government. It's just the many, many, many comments and messages and things that will be said about me or my family or my children, or my parents. And that's not something that people want to have to deal with. So when you think about that freedom of expression, I was very bold about it when I was coming to sit here. But now, as I hear, when you put it that way, I'm like, Because for me, I thought it was so much more what governments and, authority can do. But it's so much more than that. Maybe it was when it was more analog, but not so much more. And that's what we're talking about, freedom of expression in this digital era. Yeah. And even talking of that, as we talk about what we can and can't say about restrictions, Gado, let me come to you. Charlie Hebdo is a French weekly satirical newspaper that features cartoons, reports, polemics, and jokes. It has attracted considerable worldwide attention for its controversial depictions of Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad. So in January 2015, the staff were having a meeting, in their office, and then there was all these gunshots, and they thought, it was fireworks. But then these two gunmen came in and shot and killed 10 of 12 people. Yeah, and it was hatred for their cartoons, which made jokes about the Islamic leader as well as Muhammad. And this is considered to be what was the principal motive for this massacre. Then, when you think about liberty of speech, it can often protect even harsh examples of satire. For example, in the US, criticism of public figures is protected speech, okay? Satire cannot be used as a basis for libel, yeah? And that's in the States. In countries such as Italy and Germany, satire is explicitly protected by the Constitution. So there's more space to say anything about anyone, anyhow, right? And in France has a long tradition of satirists mocking religious and political institutions. Just last year, in October, Samuel Paty, again, a French middle school teacher, was beheaded by Islamic terrorists. Yeah, and he was killed because he was talking in a class of freedom of expression. He showed his students, again, those 2012 Charlie Hebdo's cartoonists depicting the Islamic prophet. So Kenya seems to have gotten, and maybe, yeah, let me talk of Kenya. Kenya seems to have gotten space, a nice playing field, and maybe a balance of some sort. And you seem to be sitting at that pivot point. You haven't gone to that extreme. You haven't.
Not really.
No, let me explain it. When you think about Paty and when you think about the France massacre, yeah, Kenya seems we have been sort of balancing very narrowly,
Yeah.
and like I said, you feel like you're sitting at that pivot point. Where have you felt like there are no-go zones for you? This is where I operate. I cannot go beyond this because then if I go there, again, it's just some place I don't want to go. So what has been your experience?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me, and it's great to be amongst good friends. First, I would also like to say that actually Tinius, one of the artists who died in Charlie Hebdo's attack, was a friend, and actually he visited Kenya twice, and we did actually conduct workshops with artists here. So it's somebody I knew, and it was actually quite sad for some of us. To bring the question home is that one is that we have always thought that once you have these freedoms, all will be well. The most difficult thing is always to defend these freedoms. Yeah. And I think what we are seeing, for example, in many African countries, especially in Kenya, is that the gains that Kenya had gained over the years, they are being eroded. And one of the important thing to note is always that dictators, authoritarian leaders, and governments would always try to claw back, to take away these gains, because they work against their interest. I mean, today, who would have thought that United States, with the history of democracy that goes, that is over 200 years, would actually be sacking satirists? Newspapers would be sacking satirists because they were mocking President Trump. So it's a good indication that at all time we should remain vigilant as far as freedom of expression is concerned. So I would say regionally Kenya has done fairly well in comparison, that is, with other with its neighbors. But we also have to be careful with that. I also was lucky enough to work in a newspaper that did a lot of, I was very protected. And so people are complaining about being trolled now. I think I've lived with that
You're
all
a
my life.
survivor.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of being, well, back then it wasn't necessarily rather online, but, you know, I'm used to receiving rude letters and threats through and through. So I kind of, you know, gotten used to that. But back to your question, is that I think I've always felt that I never try to avoid subjects, and it's very important for journalists, and I think John will tell you that. The challenge is always to find ways how to tackle the subjects. So I don't run away from them, but I find ways of actually of tackling them. So there are no go areas for me. However, as a satirist, as an editorial cartoonist, I also have freedom of choice. So I think, you know, I choose also not to tackle certain subjects for whatever reasons, not because I don't want or not because I feel that I offend people. Unfortunately, actually, I'm in a business of offending people. So it's a little bit, you know, it's you know, it's awkward for me. But yeah, then most satirists will tell you that. So, and it is also dangerous to start probably creating those kind of boundaries around yourself, because then you will limit yourself. Now, there is a very good quote that, you know, I don't know it's attributed to who, but says, the evils of free speech are far much less than the evils of actually curbing that freedom. So yes, there are issues, and especially when you're dealing with sensitive issues, especially, you know, in many African countries where, for example, religious issues are quite touchy. But I've fought, even with my editors all the time, I've always fought to comment on them and actually to have an opinion on them, because it's important as a society. As we move on, we must discuss these issues. In fact, we must discuss the very difficult issues. And we should be able to sort our differences by discussing these difficult issues. So I'm totally against the idea of creating these boundaries and saying probably these issues, this should not be discussed or that should not be discussed. It is completely unacceptable. These issues are difficult, but they should be discussed. And we should build a habit as a society, as a country, to discuss these issues, however difficulty they are.
I like the way you've put it, freedom of choice, because it is in my freedom of choice that I choose how I'm going to express myself. Yeah? I choose that I'll write. I choose that I'll dance. I choose that I'll be a journalist. I choose, you know, at the end of the day. And then the choices I make, then I have to deal with whatever comes in that space, right? The things that John Alanamu has to deal with and the things that you have to deal with may be similar, but then they could also be very, very different because of the choices you've made in the way that you choose to express yourself. But also it's the fact that we are choosing to challenge something.
Yeah.
I find in satire, it's very religious and political by and large. Is that intentional? And if so, why?
Well, satire speaks truth to power, and religious organizations and they are power. You know, governments are power, and so and they don't like to be spoken the truth. They don't want to hear the truth, and so that's and that, you know, it goes way back. It's you know, since antiquity that this is a problem that has been there, and so they would like to protect that. And also, it's important to realize that this struggle of speaking truth to power will continue, because power would like to protect, power would like to protect it, so that actually it's for the few. And so governments, if you, for example, if you were to take the example of here in Kenya, I mean, through and through, the government has governments have fought against reforms, for example. It has been the opposition, the press, the media, the civil society, and to some extent also religious leaders to actually force the government to the table. So it is important that that is not lost. Yes, as a country again, that actually is kept alive.
What you're talking about is power, yeah, and power in religious spaces and through government. And I think what the common thread I see is that the ability of that freedom of expression to this power is what is changing our societies, is what is changing our countries. And that's why we have to keep pushing for these freedoms, because if we don't, then what's going to happen, right? And we have to be bold in finding ways, the best ways possible, to express ourselves in ways that we can be heard and that these difficult conversations can be had. Let me introduce Nanjala, who's just joined us. Welcome, Nanjala. Nanjala is a writer, a political analyst, and activist based in Nairobi. She writes extensively about African society and politics, technology, international law, and feminism for academic and non-academic publications. Nanjala is a published author of The Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, that was recently launched, and I was very privileged to attend. And she's also an author of Traveling While Black. She's a frequent contributor to the BBC World Service, particularly on issues around Kenyan politics and technology. Nanjala, I have to ask this. As a woman expressing yourself the way you do online, have you struggled in feeling heard? Have you ever felt that there's something that I'm trying to bring out here and it feels like people are not quite getting it, and I need to find a way to just keep pounding and pounding and pounding until this topic is discussed?
I think anyone who tries to, like John Allen was talking about the cacophony, like trying to rise above the sheer volume of information that is online at any one moment. I think there's always that sense of, is this coming across? Am I hitting all the right notes in terms of, are people getting the significance of this? I think trying to draw attention especially to things that are not, what I see myself doing is kind of an act of translation, trying to take things that are spoken about in specialist circles, in policy circles, in insider circles, and making them every day to ordinary people. I want ordinary people to feel empowered to talk about the refugee crisis. I want ordinary people to feel empowered to talk about COVID vaccines, to feel empowered to talk about technology, to feel empowered to be part of these conversations, because I think the downside of this era of specialization is that we are taking really important conversations away from ordinary people and having them in these abstract things that don't connect to the real world. So that's what I see myself doing. And when you do that, there's always this sense of how much data, how much history, how much context, how much is too much. Because I think, again, people, it's not even just the noise, is that people want everything to be so simplified. And sometimes it's just not that simple. So, yeah, you do get moments. I've definitely had moments where it's like, I think that people are missing how this connects to something else and what this looks like in a 20-year arc as opposed to a 2-minute arc. I think for the first 7 or 8 years that I was in the public eye, nobody knew that I was a woman because I wasn't really doing press. So I think I got a chance to incubate an audience where people were listening to what I was saying. It's a little bit different now. I think every woman who's in the public eye has had this experience whereby when men criticize you, they don't criticize your ideas, they criticize you. You know, like the other day I was talking about, you know, don't call her Lady Chief Justice, call her Chief Justice because XYZ. And this person responds, why are you feminazis? And I was like, I've literally just given you like condensed 60 years of legal history into 250 words, and this is your line of attack. And that is, it's lazy. It's intellectually lazy, and it's stuff, and it's you know, you don't pay attention. You try not to pay attention to things like that. But overall, I would say it's very difficult in this day and age to get yourself and other people to think about one thing over a sustained period of time and with a significant amount of depth. So, yeah.
It's interesting when you talk about you not being known as a woman in the time that you did that, and also the Chief Justice now being called Lady Chief Justice. Well, we never called man justice. It just sounds even awkward. But then just the other day, this week again, we were having a conversation with Shefa, and she said every time she went for a conversation to the media, people just talked about her hair.
Yeah.
You know? She came with ideas, she came with important conversation, she came with important points. But when people talked about Shefa, they talked about her hair, what color it was, how long it was, whether it was a weave or a wig, or what color of dye she'd put. Every time, and she made it a point because she's a woman and she loves what she does with her hair, and she has freedom of choice. She also did whatever it is she wanted to do with her hair, until such a time when some people were able to get enough of this hair talk and say, okay, what is she really talking about, you know? And the sad thing is that the substance of women, the fact that I appear here as a woman, you first see me as that and you don't hear me, right? And you're judging me because of what I look like, what I'm wearing, how my clothes are fitting. But when you look at Alan, you and Gado and Abdi here, you're listening to what he's saying. Yeah, you're like, yeah, he has a really important point. But when you look at the women, you don't hear what they say. And I feel like women struggle to say what they want to say, to get heard. And I guess because it's the men who are listening, I think men really need to pull up in this end. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. I think broadly speaking, it really just depends on the size of the audience, the where the message is going, and all of that stuff. I think on the digital platforms, I feel like there is a tendency, I think John Allen was talking about this before. People don't always use digital platforms with intent because the cost of communication is so low. If you had to send an SMS for every single tweet that you put out, and you were charged 50 cents for every SMS that you put out, a lot of people would stop and think about what it is that they're saying. Yeah. They wouldn't just say tweet at the first person that they disagree with. And I think tied to that also is a lot of displaced anger that lands on people and lands on women especially, because people don't have other avenues of expressing themselves. So like, in the first book, I wrote a little bit about Peter Eke, who is this Nigerian, I think, scholar, who writes about this idea of two publics, that we always exist in two ways, especially those of us who live in these post-colonial societies, right? So like we have the English-speaking Nairobi, and we have the Kiswahili-speaking Nairobi, the Sheng-speaking Nairobi. Like we all have these different versions of ourselves. And I think what's happened online is a lot of people are saying things that they wouldn't say to you if you were in the same room. They wouldn't say them to your face. There's this sort of convergence of our worst selves and our best selves and our public selves and our private selves that makes people think that it's okay because of the shield of anonymity and the volume. They think that their meanness will hide in the volume of conversation that's happening. And this is I think one of the real fundamental questions that I think theorists of the space, and because women are the canary in the coal mine. If you see what happened with the this Milo Yiannopoulos and all of that thing, it started with attacking women. It started with doxing women, Gamergate. It started with that, escalates to stealing an election. It's happening here too. The people that you see who are being used to drive these trolling activities, to drive all of these people, they start with women. They start by making lists of, activist women and putting them on Facebook. That's how it begins. And it's left unchecked, it coalesces into something else. That momentum sort of picks up, wake up one morning and, the chief of staff of the president is a former troll. And these are the kind of things that it makes them important, not just for the safety of the women, which is important, and the ability of women to experience the internet, which is important, but to see it as part of a broader sense of, if we tolerate abuse and if we tolerate trolling, doxing, all of these things against women, we are creating a culture that incubates the kind of behavior that will eventually escalate into something else. And this has happened everywhere. Brazil, India, US, UK, Germany. It starts with tolerating, normalizing, accepting the abuse of women online.
That is so true, because if it stays unchecked, then, like you said, we are creating a culture. And then what happens to what matters to women, what things that are of importance to women. And it makes me wonder, how, as a political analyst, what's your take on the state of freedom of expression currently in Kenya and in East Africa? And how does the digitization of our society affect the nature of this democracy?
You know, that's a really good question. I think that we have lost so much ground in the last, I would say, 7-8 years. I think in the region.
Why.
Yeah, I wonder why. Just a coincidence. I think we've lost a lot of ground, and I think it's one of those things where, you know, if you put you don't put frogs in boiling water, but if you put a frog in boiling water, it will immediately jump out. Yeah. But if you put it in cold water and you turn up the temperature progressively, it will not notice until it's too late. I think we're in a situation where the temperature is being raised slowly and slowly and slowly, and people are not paying attention. And I think I'll give an example is this COVID, this pandemic. So I recently went on my very first international trip since the pandemic started. I was in Tanzania. And I was really struck not just by the fact that people are saying that there is no COVID in Tanzania, but that people believe that there is no COVID in Tanzania and are acting accordingly. And so, you know, I'm sort of masked up and double masked up and washing my hands every 3 minutes. And it's like, what are you doing? We prayed, it's gone. And the thing is, the correlation between authoritarianism and failing public health with this pandemic, it's like a 1-to-1. The countries that are having the worst outcomes, the countries that are having the highest death rates, are all the countries whereby instead of addressing the public health issue, they went for the critics. They went for the people who were raising the alarm. They went for the people who are saying this is a problem. You know, the Indian government taking down tweets that people are criticizing, Bolsonaro, you know, arresting critics. So the stakes are that high. It is really a life or death issue. And I think that because the temperature is being turned up on us slowly, people don't realize that this is one of the first freedoms to go. And I agree so much with what Gado was saying about how freedom of expression is one of those things that it will create problems, but the absence of freedom of expression will create much worse problems. And really what we want is to have freedom of expression framed by a culture of respect, framed by a culture of tolerance, framed by a culture of integrity, so that when people are in the public eye, you know, satirists are holding on to the principle that my job is to hold power into account. My job is not to bully people who don't have power. My job is to tell the truth. My job is not to pick on people. And in cultures where there's a freedom of expression that is framed around, and I think this is one thing maybe that a lot of African countries can teach, you know, those of us who have pluralist societies, is that I can be as Christian as I want, and you know, Abdi can be as Muslim as he wants, and we'll sit together and we'll be able to have a conversation and not have it escalate into some kind of violence. I think that, but that's not a legislative thing. That's not a law thing. That's respect. That's a culture of respect, and I think that's what we need to be moving towards. But we're going in the other direction. We're losing the law, and we're losing the culture of respect.
Just to add to Nanjala's point is I also always remind my fellow satirists that, you know, speaking truth to power is also power. And it is actually, you know, so it comes with a huge responsibility. And so I've always felt that as a satirist, I'm very privileged because I can actually say things that other people cannot say. in a very, direct way, or in so many ways. And so over the years, I've also learned that it's a huge responsibility, in the sense that, yes, you have actually also, that I talked about, freedom of choice. That and to Nanjala's point is that there has to be also integrity. There has to be also respect, especially today in the era of social media and the internet, because whatever you do, it is out there. So you can actually work with that in that form.
I like what you were saying about being on social media is not about getting down, going for someone who doesn't have the power. Yeah, it needs to be about speaking truth to power. It needs to be about making change, and that, for me, is the power of the freedom of expression that we're talking about. The freedom, the kind of freedom that we need to be fighting for, and trying to defend. Because if we lose it, then there's so much at stake, and we need to be able to stand in our own spaces and defend that freedom. I'm just wondering, what lessons do you all think that we could teach the world with respect to digital democracy? But before I even go there, we were having a conversation again about democracy. And with women in particular, when we talk about democracy, the way news is produced, the way news is made, it is made by men, it is made for men, it is about men, it is about the things that, by and large, interest men. And even when you think about what time the news is shared in our country, it's at 7 p.m. and at 9 p.m. At 7 p.m., I'm running around ensuring homework is done and children are fed and dinner is ready. So by the time 7 is coming, maybe I'm putting food on the table at 7:30, right? Because I also came from work. And then news is there, and it has passed. So the men, my dad would come home, and 6:30, we're running around trying to make dinner. And then at 7, it's news time. Yeah? Then, we'll do our homework and blah, blah, blah. My mom is running around. And then by 9, she's making sure that dinner dishes are washed. You guys are ready for school. Your bag is clean, your lunchbox, blah, 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 all that. Again, she'd miss the news. So even the rare opportunities she got to see the news, it was really nothing of interest to her. It's what was there. It's just that she got a chance to sit down. Yet I feel like if there was something interesting, something that really caught her attention, and when I say her, I mean women, yeah? The moms and just the women in our homes. If there was something truly interesting, she'd make time for it. Yeah, the same way men will make time to catch that news in Kiswahili at 7 and at 9 in English. Like, it's the same stuff, but, you want to listen to it in 2 languages, right? So it makes me wonder, when you talk of democracy, there's more women in this country than there is men. And I believe in a lot of countries, the population of women is more than that of men. Yet, when you talk of democracy, first of all, you've cut out, let me use 51% to, as an indication that it's the women that are more. So you've cut out the 51%, by and large. So you're left with this 49%, okay? This 49% is not that the whole 49% are interested in the news that is being produced. So let's even take that to 30%. I won't even cut it by half. So again, when we talk of democracy, what are we talking about?
This is very interesting. There's a sort of deeper question that is underneath that, which is who owns the means of production when it comes, and who controls the means of transmission when it comes to information. And this is something that I think about a lot with regards to technology, because technology is very gendered in a lot of poor countries. That if there's one mobile phone in the house, it generally belongs to the man. If there is one radio, there is the man who is controlling it. If there is one television set, it's the man who is setting the what's going to get watched, what doesn't get watched. And in Kenya, it's been a very interesting thing that because women are the slight majority of small and medium enterprise owners, the mama mbogas, the women who feed us, that's kind of one of the main factors that I hypothesize has driven a slight democratization of the mobile phone. that women needed to do the M-Pesa loan in the morning, trade, and then come back. But it wasn't the case with the radio, and it certainly wasn't the case with television. And I think in the process of moving digital, of moving towards the digital, one of the things that gets lost is that the vast majority of people in this country and in the poor world in general get their news from radio. And so there's a growing gap between the speed at which people who are on the phone are getting information and the people who get it on the radio are getting information. But there's also been an infiltration of hate speech and extremist language. We don't know what people are listening to because there are 300 radio stations and they're all broadcasting in multiple languages. The oversight mechanisms can barely function in English, let alone, in this particular one dialect of, Luya and this one particular dialect of, Samburu. So there's a gap between the people who make the news and the people who are in the news and the people who need the news to participate in the democratic action. And it's a gap that manifests, I think, especially around election time, when you see how, when you just talk to people in voting lines, what is it that's, why are you here? What is it that's driving you? And I think, like you said, like women are getting the short end of the stick because of all of these underlying gender dynamics of who owns and who listens and who gets to control the radio. But I also think, I also think that it's important for those of us who make the news to think about it in these terms. Start with the person who is most removed from power. How are they going to interact with this information? I don't think that anybody in Lodwar, even in Busia, even in, Kirinyaga, is going to read my tweets. I don't think that they will. And so I have to think as a person who's trying to have this conversation, how can I get this idea to travel so that it can at least get close to that? And that doesn't necessarily mean working with, compromised outlets. It just means finding creative ways of thinking about how news is transmitted. Is it a question of working with religious radio? Is it a question of working with, Kiswahili language newspapers? Is it a question of working with outlets that we haven't traditionally considered to be the main platform for transmitting information? I don't think that the digital has yet displaced all of the other ways of knowing, all of the other ways of getting information. I really don't. And I don't think it will for a long time because of all of these inequalities that are embedded in the way in which we get our information. I do think, though, that what the digital does is it sets the agenda. Is that the people who are tweeting, who are on Facebook, who are on WhatsApp, whatever, and WhatsApp is going to be the game changer. WhatsApp, in the last election, I was in Turkana quite a bit for the last election, and I was really shocked at how important WhatsApp is to political organizing in Turkana. And I imagine it would be the same in other parts of northern Kenya, that people it has just made the kind of, we're here, can you bring posters? We're here, can you bring t-shirts? We're here. Like, it's made a level of political organizing possible that wasn't even possible 5 years ago. I think WhatsApp is gonna be the game changer. And the problem is, as from a researcher perspective, we can't measure what's happening on WhatsApp until it's happened, until there is, something. We don't know what people are talking about. So all of which is to say, I think that the way in which we think about information, political information especially, but information in general traveling is impacted by all of these gendered, economic, socioeconomic dimensions. And we as newsmakers have to be more intentional about navigating some of these pitfalls.
Just want to add on your question. We call it digital inequality, and it's reflection of the lifestyle of our society in the offline context. Again, let's go back to the offline context, how our society behaves, how is the gender inequality in our traditional lifestyle, how women are viewed and are treated in the normal offline context. And last year, we had a session on online harassment against female journalists and female activists and female bloggers. In our discussion, we I suggested that this session should entirely be, exclusively be female. The moderator, the panelists, audience, everyone, the cameraman, the camera woman itself should be all women. And one of the outcome, it was really very positive, and the outcome was that if a woman, for instance, in where I come from, if she passes in the street, men will start commenting on her body, on clothes or dress. The same woman, if she posts her picture online, or even leave the picture, if he just posts a comment online, people will not now commenting on the post itself. Now they will go back again to the body and the profile picture, maybe previous pictures. So it's a reflection of our traditional way, and I think that also should be addressed first. And then I think it will be much more easier for us to address women's presence in the online space. I also want to go back to your previous question on are we free to express in the digital space. As much as we enjoy and privileged to have access to internet and have access to social media platforms, I think I have more than 50 drafted tweets in my draft that every time when I draft and I try to tweet it, I post, and then I say, okay, this will cause backlash from the community, from the power holders, because in my country we have a very organized state-sponsored trolls and propagandists. And it happened to me in 2019, in December, actually, when I tweeted something very simple, not that sensitive, actually, even in our context. I just tweeted about a curriculum, a national curriculum that was developed by our government, which was very, very good and very nice. It was just in Somali language, and I just asked it, what if could have been developed this in English or in Arabic, the two major language that comes after Somali in our country. Somali is our first speaking language, second is Arabic, third is English. And the level of attacks, the level of abuse, the level of, even leveling my name, questioning my identity, my religious itself, I was off from social media for 2 weeks, actually, because I had other deadlines to deal with. It was end year, so I had other reports to finalize. I didn't want to deal with that toxic comments and posts. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. I think also that's something that needs to be addressed, which is, I always help activists. Power adapts and power learns. And so we have to always constantly try and be one step ahead, because this is a huge problem in Africa right now, that we have armies of paid, sponsored government trolls that are designed to go after critics. Somalia, Ethiopia, Rwanda, like you can't even breathe in the wrong direction, the amount of vitriol that comes your way. I mean, here they're still a little bit chaotic because I think we're just chaotic people. But it's becoming standard practice for governments to retain troll armies in order to silence their critics, to bully their critics into silence. And it's increasingly being leveled against journalists. It's become a problem with journalists who are covering conflict and who are covering conflict context. They might not even be writing about the war. They might be writing about a curriculum. They might be writing about, something. And it's become a growing problem. And I think the challenge is to find the balance again between protecting the right of people to criticize power and creating a context where power doesn't use the same techniques to silence its own critics. That the arguments that we use to defend our freedom don't become appropriated and become arguments that power uses to say, why do you hate Africans? The ones that I've gotten the most is, you are a puppet of the West. Because you can't, anything that you say, it's so common, and you think to yourself, well, if I'm a puppet, I'm a terrible puppet, because yesterday when I was saying, the West is doing X, Y, Z, I was not a puppet. But today, because I'm saying, you can't level criticism against, and that's going to become a huge problem, I think, because the generation that's coming afterwards, we call them the digital natives, the people who are going to be turning 18, 19, 20 in the next couple of years, maybe will not have read, all of the liberation texts that we take for granted, will not have read Fanon, will not have read all of these people. And so will get a big chunk of their political education from what we put online. And if they're getting their political education in a context where the loudest voices are the ones telling them that criticizing your government is unpatriotic, we're going to end up with a generation of people who cannot distinguish between criticism that's trying to make the society work better and criticism that is, as they said, you're a puppet of the West and whatever. And I think for me, this is one of the changes that I've seen online since, I would say, the last 5 years, that there's a generation coming of young, digitally savvy Africans who unfortunately aren't getting the same political education that we take for granted, and cannot make some of these contextual judgments that we are maybe not doing a good job of showing, well, actually, you can say bad things about you should say bad things about your government if they're not showing up for you.
Call it out.
Call it
It's
out.
about calling it out,
Yeah.
not so much as just saying it for the sake of, but
No.
because it makes a difference that you're able to put it out there the way it should be. Maybe just to segue into the next section is, what do you think Kenya can teach Europe, or let's start with what can Kenya teach Europe about digital democracy? And then we will come to what can we learn that is working out there that we could apply, because we're talking about speaking truth to power, and this is our freedom of expression, and this is the thing that we want to defend and build and protect. So what can we teach Europe in terms of our digital democracy and our freedom of expression? Who wants to go first?
Okay, let me take a
Thank you.
let me take a stab at this. I think the best lessons that I've learned are lessons that are learned painfully, right? Unfortunately,
Yeah.
right? And so what we can teach is something that Nanjala was pointing towards this, is that a society's culture will be transposed onto the digital space. And therefore you must work harder on the culture, if anything, than on the digital space. What Nanjala was talking about, cultures of tolerance and that sort of thing, you see the opposite of that in our society, in our culture. So if you have a culture of impunity, you will have things that are said with impunity online. If you have a culture where women are consistently disrespected, where they are constantly in danger, you'll see it online. And it'll be done in such a matter-of-fact way that it does become normal.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the lessons that I'm learning is that question of culture. Culture eats talent, eats law for breakfast. So, there are things that you cannot fix with just the law. You fix through the example, the power of your example. And fortunately or unfortunately, this is what we learn on a consistent basis. Look at our neighbors to the south, right? When Samia Suluhu, came to power in Tanzania, I'd say a large amount of people were really waiting on what the difference would be between her and her predecessor, the late Magufuli, in terms of respect, in terms of the culture of freedom of expression, and that sort of thing. And even the small things, even the small sort of advances that she's made towards speaking with the opposition, those have been taken, I'd say, very positively. And it tells you that when that kind of a culture is engendered, it helps a society flourish. And it's a thing that I don't think we can, it's sort of like a classroom where we're all teaching each other at the same time. So, Europe will come up with laws about, respect for digital privacy and that sort of thing. But the culture, the subnationalistic culture, racism and that sort of thing, still show you that even the laws that you create do not matter as long as the culture isn't fixed. So I'd say that those underpinnings, those pillars, are really, they're sacred, and you don't fix culture in one day, you don't fix it in a week, you fix it over time. But it is through the power of the example, specifically of leadership, of the top tier leadership, to say certain things about our culture and lead through the power of their examples, that will then now start to have an impact, because people consistently look towards these offices, towards these places for that. Through the power of people's examples, then a culture can change. And I think that's the thing about Africa, where you have these many diverse examples of where powerful examples are consistently being made out there, and as are negative ones. To speak about what's happening in Somalia right now, if you have a culture where there is a political debate that cannot be resolved except through, grandstanding that leads to violence, then that tells you something about that society. If we're talking about Kenya, unfortunately, the last refuge of a scoundrel seems to be in national leadership. You understand? Right?
Yeah,
So if the scoundrels of our society can find their way into the highest offices in this country, what does that say about the culture in our society? And therefore, all you will be seeing online is just an example of that. So that's where I would start. I don't know whether it's an answer about teaching, but
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it because it tells us about our societies, about what we are seeing on social media. Our expressions are telling us about what's going on in our countries. So, again, it's a reflection. Like, if you don't know what's going on, go back online and see what are people saying about our country. What's happening? What are we complaining about? What truths are we trying to speak to power? Because then that tells us where we are. And even as I think governments need to be looking to see what truths are being, well, we're calling them truths because that's what they are, but then they want to call it fake news, and they want to banish the people who are saying this, and penalize and threaten, and put people on the defense and to run for their lives. But yet, what is being said is what is truly happening on the ground. That famous saying, "Vitu kwa ground ni different." Yeah. You're different. Is that's the truth? That's what's truly happening, and that's what we really need to think about. So, maybe just in winding, as we are, like I said, there's a summit that's happening in France in July, and usually it's been held by heads of state, but this year, for the first time, it's being held by, it's bringing together players of civil society, and we're talking about entrepreneurs, intellectuals, researchers, artists, athletes, journalists, basically allowing us a fresh look at Africa's relationship with itself and also with the West. So as we're talking about what can we learn and what we can learn from Europe, maybe just what recommendations, and I like what you were saying about looking inward and seeing what is being said. So what recommendations can we give or are out there that we can borrow to expand and defend and protect this freedom of expression, that space?
Just also to pick up
sure.
where John left off,
Yeah.
is that also it's important to note that democracy without culture, without norms, ethics, is also is nothing. And again, we can use the example of United States, and so that's also very, very important. That's the thing that, the point that I also needed to raise, to adapt to what John said. In terms of also your question, I think one of the, for me, is that how how can we link up the online efforts to offline action? I think that this has been raised, and also Nangela alluded to that. I mean, I think that's probably would be also one of the most important struggles during this digital, age in our time, because sometimes you have a lot of noise and stuff going on online, and because I always laugh and say that before the peddlers of fake news were governments and others. Now it's the governments have no monopoly to that, so it is out there, and everybody has joined the party, and so it's actually quite challenging. So voices, are not only muffed, all this, but it is actually most of the time. Sometimes what I find it quite challenging is also you find news media and everybody out there, joins this actually the noise, this decibel, and the noise, instead of actually, taking a step and said, wait a minute, what is happening? So that is actually because people are doing that so that they can get followers, they can actually get likes, they can do that, and everybody is doing that. And I think that, to me, if you are to link up to, what are we going to do to influence positive action offline, is actually is quite important. So one, I suppose this is a big discussion that has been going on, is that what can we do, to force also, tech giants also, to be part of the solution. And I think this has to be deliberate. I think it has started happening in the United States and other countries. But, in Africa, we are, our policymakers and our politicians and leaders are silent. One of why they're doing that partly is also because they benefit from that. A lot of people benefit from this noisy, from what's going on. So I think it is critical that, for me, that is actually addressed. That how can you bring on board these tech giants and actually, so that they're part of the solution, and they have to understand this is not about profits alone. It's not about profits alone. It's about people's lives. It's about the future of the future generations and so forth. So that actually is one thing that should be taken on board.
Sorry, let me just add something before you move on. I think one of the things I think we can teach is you see, in Africa, perhaps because the problems that we faced are so real, that a response to them can create such a very visceral, very powerful, reaction. I think that in a positive way, there's things that are happening online that I feel can really help people understand what those offline impacts are. I'm just, with this, I'm thinking of some of the examples that I've seen with people working on areas of climate change, right? For instance, with there's a friend of mine, his name is Mshila, who works with trying to treat water, to make it usable again. And through his online presence, I find that a lot more people learn about, what they can do in small ways and in big ways to be able to preserve the water that they use. And there's these kinds of examples that you see now and again. Why I say that, in Kenya and in Africa, those reactions and perhaps those examples are good to talk about is because of how deeply they touch people's lives on a daily basis. So if there's something that we can teach, I think it's that. And then let me stop there. I think there'll be more things that as we go on.
Nangela?
Yeah. I had two things. One is that I think and this kind of touches on what John Allen was saying. I love the way that Africans online see themselves as being part of a global conversation. And so we don't think about ourselves as operating in national silos. We are constantly in conversation with people from within, East Africa, within East and West. And I think, in fact, if anything, the digital has made a new kind of Pan-Africanism possible, whereby protests in Senegal will start a conversation in Kenya, we'll start a conversation in the DRC, we'll have echoing protests, in different parts from different movements. And I think that's really important, because I think for all of the talk about the European Union and all of that, I think a lot of Europeans still see themselves as being part of a national entity first, and over everything else. And yet for us who are coming from a context where regional organization isn't at that level yet, I think it's really cool that people see themselves as being in conversation. Like, we're learning about, and threads, people are putting up about historians in South Africa, and people who are putting up threads about, this person did this in Chad. Like, I think it's really cool that we're doing that. And I think one impact that it's having is that it's also forcing the formal institutions to start to think about themselves in that way. That because we are raising the alarm about, what happened in Chad, that the formal organizations have to modify, their responses to that. And you'll see it if you pay attention to regional organizations the way I do, like the press releases, you'll see that the language starts to change, because you can no longer say, yeah, there was a change of power and the new guy's president, because people will go online and say, how did he become president? Was there an election? Were you there? Did you count the votes? So now you have to say, you have to qualify the language, because there's going to be some people are watching. And that is because, we couldn't do this because if the TV is controlled by the government, if the radio is controlled by the government, if the newspapers are controlled, you can't say things like that. Yeah. But here's the space that I think this new energy of Pan-Africanism has found itself, and is pushing small increments, but is pushing for a new way about thinking about what it means to be a Pan-Africanist, to be an African in this day and age. And the other one is a little bit less intense, but I love the way we make fun of our leaders. And I think it's so powerful, and I think it's so beautiful. I love that every 2 weeks, the Kenyan president has a new nickname. And I think there's something so beautiful about that subversion. And I love that it's like the last stand, even as the space is shrinking, we have this last stand, and it is not just boring and angry and sterile, but it is filled with humor, and it's filled with joy, and it's filled with color. And so, we it's a paradox, right? Are we fiddling while the Titanic sinks? Maybe. But at least we're gonna have a good time. I don't know. I feel like I love the way we use humor, and I love the way we are just in conversation with each other. And I think that's definitely something that we can teach the world, that the fact that we can have this conversation, and I can say Brazil and I can say India, and you know what I'm talking about. I guarantee you, if we were having this panel in the US, if we were having this panel, at the same level in many other, in European countries, people would say, what's happening in Brazil? What's happening in India? Tell me a little bit more. But here we see a digital, Africans see themselves as being part of the world, and not just part of this national entity.
I love that we are so, I don't know if the word is patriotic, because patriotism gives us that boundary of just the Kenyan border, but we are more of global citizens, and we know a bit of what's happening just around the world. And I think that is one of our greatest strengths. And like you said, for me, I love it in the same way I hate it, that we can laugh about these things, but then, like you said, I wish there was more action offline, because there's so much action online, but then it doesn't translate to what's happening offline. And I feel like offline is where the real change would happen. I think the lesson we need to all learn, whether we are in Kenya or in Somalia or in Uganda, Tanzania, or even in Europe, in Germany or France or Italy, is how do we translate that energy and passion that we see online into the offline, right? And if we're able to crack that, then I think a lot of things we'd be able to shift them. Now, sadly, I just realized how that time is gone, not just far gone, but it's like all gone. I don't know if you've been watching us and following us on our social media handles, if there's anyone with any question that we can take. If you're following us on social media, if you will be watching this afterwards, our hashtags are Africa France KE, hashtag Africa France KE, and Digital Democracy KE. It's been a great conversation. I don't know, is there any question? Yes, no? Not any questions? So it's been really great having you all. It's been a wonderful conversation. And continue tweeting. Let's continue having these conversations like we are. Again, like we said, it's such fun that we are able to have global conversations as Kenyans. And again, that's our strength. So if we are continuing these conversations, then we are finding solutions that we can, that can be borrowed, that also we can borrow because we're on the lookout and we're listening to what's happening globally. We get solutions that we can borrow and apply that make a difference for us and that we are teaching because of how active we are. I think last but not least is we totally need to defend our freedoms because they came at a cost. And they will be more costly if we lose them. So where we need to defend, we need to come up and just occupy those spaces and truly defend what we need to defend because our freedom is at risk. And if we lose it, then we will slip so far back into places even we do not know because we are not the ones that started this fighting for it, yeah? We are not the ones that got us this freedom. Those who got us this freedom, some of them died. And if we're not able to defend these freedoms, then we will slip into the places that we don't know that existed when they were fighting for this freedom. So just to wind this up, thank you for joining us, and we hope that we can continue this conversation and see you at the summit in July. Thank you.